Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. This week, my guest on the show is the incredibly talented Safia Elhillo. Safia's work always leaves me mesmerised and craving for more. In her beautiful poetry, she explores themes of belonging, identity, home, friendship, love, pain, suffering, and so much more. Safia Elhillo is the author of The January Children, which received the Sillerman First Book Prize for African Poets and an Arab American Book Award, Girls That Never Die, and the novel in verse Home Is Not a Country, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and received a Coretta Scott King Book Award author honour. Sudanese by way of Washington DC, Safia received the 2015 Brunel International African Poetry Prize and was listed in Forbes Africa's 2018 30 Under 30. Her work appears in Poetry Magazine, Callaloo, and the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day series, among others. I'm so glad Safia is my guest today. Safia, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. It's so wonderful to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on here.
I am a huge fan of your work. I just think you're such an immensely talented poet and writer, and I have loved your your novel in verse, Home Is Not a Country, and also your poetry collection, Girls That Never Die. I just think there's so much in there, and I've just really enjoyed reading everything. I can't wait to talk to you about it today. So I'd really be interested in knowing what your writing journey has been like. Have you always been a poet? Like, where did it all come from?
Yeah, to answer your second question, I have always been a poet. I've never written a full sentence in my life. But I came to poetry as a teenager through spoken word and slam, which was not because I was a particularly performance inclined young person at all. But this was the early 2000s, and a lot of the free youth after school programming around poetry was based around spoken word and the slam. I imagine that's where a lot of the funding was going at the time. And I wanted to be a poet, and I wanted to be a poet in community with other poets specifically. I didn't want to be a poet alone in my room writing in a diary for no one to ever find out. And so this gave me access to some spaces where I was just deeply in community with other oddball teenagers like myself. And that, I think, is what kept me a poet, because it didn't feel like it was my calling or anything at that age. I wasn't particularly good, or I didn't feel any particular spark of magic when I wrote a poem. It was a thing I liked doing, but what I mostly liked doing was getting to hang out with other poets. And so I kept coming to the open mics and to rehearsals and things like that. And I think if you do anything long enough, you start to pick up some tools. And I was just it was such an immersive experience. It was such a crash course, because I was reading poetry, I was writing poetry, I was several times a week going to open mics and watching other poets perform poetry. And because this was slightly pre-YouTube, the thing about being at an open mic or at a slam or anything like that, there would be a couple of moments after the poem started, where you realized that it was about to be a really good poem. Then you really had to pay attention, because there was a good chance you would never hear that poem again after that moment. So I think it also really trained my listening ear. It taught me to very quickly absorb a poem as it was being read to me and parse out what it was that I was reacting to in the poem. So it was really a very valuable education for me as a young person. And it really stuck. I picked the one thing I wanted to do with my life when I was 16 years old and never looked left or right after that.
Wow. It's really interesting, because I guess for some people, poetry has been this sort of like spark that they had right at the beginning. And it just felt almost like a spiritual journey that someone went on from. And then I guess taking this like poetry in a private space into the public domain and making it into one's living. But I guess what you talk about is like, or what you just spoke about was about community and about finding like your people and being in a room and feeling like I love being here right now. And that I think there's something really profound about that. So how has it been having poetry as your career? Because although I guess slightly different journey, but still career, poetry is your creative expression. So what is it like really having your creative expression as your career?
It's changed a lot of my relationship to it, where, first of all, I don't really have any hobbies anymore. You know what I mean? My main hobby became my job. So I've been in this years-long pursuit of a hobby and nothing has quite stuck. I've gotten recently really into playing chess, so maybe that'll be my hobby. But a thing to do with my time that I'm not expected to be professionally good at. I think I was so young when, and I was professionalized quite young as a poet. And so I don't really know how to just have a low stakes recreational relationship to anything I do, which I think is a major character flaw. So that I very actively avoid doing things that I'm not already good at, which I think is a pretty significant personality red flag, to be honest. But as you mentioned, it did used to be about personal expression. It was how I processed my life as I was experiencing it. It was how I processed the world as I was experiencing it. And now I write poetry for a living. It's my job. Which means that most of the time, if I'm writing a poem, it is with engaging with the possibility that it will be published at some point. So it just means that there are a lot more steps in between having an experience and writing a poem, because I'm pretty willing to put a lot of my business in the work. It still has to be something that I have more or less processed on my own first before it's published in a poem. Like, that's still like an open gaping wound of mine, and then it's in a book. You know what I mean? That just makes my life difficult. But what that means is sometimes there is an open gaping wound, and as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, all the way up to maybe being a 22, 23-year-old, the impulse was to be like, okay, something hurts. Let me go write a poem about it. And I can't really do that anymore, because that's like being like, something hurts. Let me go do my job about it. I think I really came of age in that particular era where everyone was like, poetry is like therapy. The thing is, it's not. Therapy is like therapy. Poetry is like poetry. And so I have had to undo that association, where there are some things that are for therapy that need treatment, and some things that need creative writing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it means that I has been taken out of my process now, where I have to ask 5 questions before I sit down to write a poem at all. And so it means that I write so much less than I did when I was like an eager, excited teenager with 10,000 ideas, and everything that happened to me was fodder for a poem. And that's how I found the silver lining in all of the things that hurt me, is at least I could get a poem out of it. Now, because of like experience and craft and things like that, I can write a poem that behaves like an open wound, but it's not actually an open wound. If it's on the page, if it's in a book, if it's bound and published, that means I'm okay about the thing being discussed. And I wonder if it's that I miss the thing itself, or I just miss the moment in my life. But I miss the moment in my life where that was how I worked things out for myself. And on the positive end, I felt as a young person that it gave me a lot of agency over my experiences, where maybe I couldn't control the things that happened, but I could harness them in some very helpful and useful to me as a young person. The dark side of that is I very much came of age in a poetry culture where the kind of governing belief is that the most interesting things about you were the things that hurt you the most. And so if you weren't going through something painful, if like something traumatic and awful wasn't happening, then you would have nothing to write a poem about. You know what I mean? A little bit, there are two ways to look at it. And so I try not to overly romanticize that period either. Things are very different now in my relationship to poetry. I even just like on a basic process level, when I was younger, I used to sit down to write a poem because I had an idea about what I wanted the poem to be about. Sit down and write a poem about my family, about heartbreak, about XYZ. And that, I don't know at what point this changed, but it just, that's not how my brain works anymore. And so it's usually from something a lot more ephemeral. I'm like feeling around in the dark for a lot of the early draft of the poem. Usually it'll be because I really like a word and I'm like, let me write a line using this word. Or I start from a place of form a lot more now than I ever used to, where I'll be like, let me write a ghazal. So it's, I guess my relationship to content has changed, where obviously the poems still have content and they're still fairly straightforward and narrative. It's not like a content first process anymore, which is helpful. A lot of content is off limits now.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I know you said that you do miss that, whether it was that time or that, like being able to do that, but do you feel a sense of loss? Because hearing you talk about it, it feels like the changes has been so much. And my experience, especially from speaking to a number of authors that have been published, when you're writing for publication, there are so many more, I don't know, like constraints and so many things you're second guessing yourself on. And you mentioned earlier as well that you don't want to write something unless it's good. And I'm sure everything that you write is amazing anyway, but to have that amount of pressure is so difficult. But what we expect from creativity is for it to be free and somewhat free flowing and healing. And do you feel like a sense of loss with that? Or do you feel like you've been able to make it work for you?
It's very interesting to frame it that way, because it does. I'm trying to think of it now in terms of loss. I don't feel a sense of loss. I don't think. I actually feel very celebratory of my hard-won boundaries. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think what I do feel a little bit of, and I'm a little bit of a toxic nostalgic, so it might be this as well. What I miss, I think, is not how I used to write poetry, like my own like spontaneous boundaryless relationship to poetry. I don't miss that. I think I miss, or not even miss, but I think I am contending with the loss of a particular moment in time, in history, in culture, where I think I came of age in the last moment where everything was ephemera. Open mic and read a poem about whatever, and there would be no record of it afterwards. And so it was a very safe place to try things out and be like, this works, this doesn't work, but with the like really helpful sounding board of doing it in a room with an audience. I think such an integral part of my education as a poet, where I could have literally a first draft of something written out in a notebook, go out in front of a room full of people who I mostly did not know, look them in the face, read my new poem, and gauge and use that information to then go and revise my poem. And that's fundamentally impossible now. Everything is part of the archive now, which like obviously is positive in a lot of ways. I think it's really democratized access to poetry. And I'm like consuming a lot more poetry now than I did then, because I don't have to leave the house to go to an open mic and stay up late. I can be anywhere. But it also, I think it just is not as forgiving of a space to not be good at something yet. You know what I mean? Or to be trying stuff out that might fail or be misunderstood or isn't that good, or whatever. So I felt a real freedom and fearlessness, I think, at that moment, which is in part, I think, probably about youth sense, but also about the world that I lived in, where I like I knew two people with a camera phone at that point. The world is very different now, and that just is what it is. I'm not necessarily sad that the world has changed, but I think I feel loss in the sense that I had access to a particular set of circumstances that are no longer available.
Yeah, because obviously, like, you can write and nobody has to see it. And I don't know if you do that, but I know that, like, you can do that. But I guess if you are interested in being part of the poetry scene in any way, whether it's online or whether it's in person, you're absolutely right. The space is not forgiving in the sense that it is like locked into history for forever because it's recorded. And I had never thought about that, but that is, I guess, it could be your worst nightmare if you have succeeded in your field as a poet or, say, as a singer or anything, and then this video emerges of you 10 years ago when you're just trying to find your feet and you're flailing and it's just a really awful performance, and you've now done it, but this video now re-emerges, and I can just imagine that that isn't like, that would be such a big fear. But also in that moment, how it's difficult to find then the space to grow, because it feels like the judgment is so hard, and I guess it's like almost immortalized in some ways. Whereas before, you could just go home from an open mic night and go to sleep and forget about it. Wake up next morning, everyone's forgotten anyway, because or a few people in the room were the only ones that know, and you may never see them again. So I completely get that. That's really interesting. And you spoke before about now that you approach writing and poetry differently, and sometimes you're thinking about form even to begin with. And Home is Not a Country is a novel in verse. I keep on saying a verse in novel. It's a novel in verse, which I find to be such a fascinating form. And I loved reading it because it's very transportive, very emotional, like, just really, I don't know, because it's shorter than, I guess, like a standard novel, but still pack so much in because it's poetry. But I can only imagine how difficult it is to write in that form. How did you find writing in that form instead of just plain poems?
I knew I wanted to write a novel, but before Home is Not a Country, I'd never written narrative before. I had never written plot before. I literally had in my poet brain, I have very little sense of event. I don't have a sense of things happening. In a poem, I can be like, the sky was blue. That's something happening. And so I knew that I was going to have to learn plot, cause and effect, characters. You like set up some circumstances for a character, you have to follow through. You can't just park them somewhere and then never revisit them again in the book. So that was already new and difficult, and would have felt like kind of an impossible undertaking for me if on top of all that, I also had to learn to write in prose, because I don't know how to do that. I have been writing exclusively in verse since I was 15, 16 years old, over half my life now. The only time I write in full sentences is like in an email. And so it was always going to be in verse if it was going to get written, because I don't know how to do the other thing yet. And as I get more comfortable with narrative, which is still an education, it's such a baby narrative writer, especially compared to life in poetry is 16, 17 years old now, something like that. And my life in narrative is 3, 4 years old. So the two will never catch up. But I think what the poetry can do is just create like some familiarity, some training wheels for me while I learn to do this new thing. Where I love Home is Not Country. I'm very proud of it. And I can see now, I can see the seams in it pretty clearly. I can see the stuff I was like learning on the job, and in which I might have done things differently now. But so it was a no-brainer for it to be in verse. It also, one of my all-time favorite books ever is a book by Anne Carson called Autobiography of Red, which is a novel in verse, but which the first handful of times I read it, because I didn't know what a novel in verse was, I thought it was just a collection of connected poems with recurring characters and some event. And I had always wanted to write a book like that, but I, again, fundamentally misunderstood it. And I thought that it was, there's a kind of poetry collection called a project book, which like orbits a specific set of themes, conceits, maybe has recurring characters, things like that. So after I initially fell in love with Autobiography of Red, I was like, oh, I'm going to write my version of Autobiography of Red, which is a project book, a collection of poems that are interconnected. So my first book of poetry is called The January Children, and that is my attempt at Autobiography of Red. And then years later, I was having a conversation with a friend about how I would never write narrative, and he was like, okay, whatever. Anyway, what are your favorite books? And I start rhapsodizing about Autobiography of Red, and he was like, cool, that's a novel, right? And that just completely exploded my sense of genre. And it made it feel more possible because that is a book that I have been studying for 10, 11 years now, something like that. And so it made it feel closer to the realm of stuff that I already knew how to do or could figure out how to do based on the things I knew how to do. So yeah, the poetry stuff was, it was almost easier to write those poems than poems that I would write for a poetry collection, because sometimes I had to ease up on them a little bit, where sometimes the role of a poem in that book would just be to move the plot along. And so I didn't hold it to the same like rigorous standards that I would hold a poem that was going to, you know, where for a poetry collection, I need each poem to stand on its own. It needs to have a life of its own. If I were to put it in a journal or a magazine or read it out loud or whatever, it needs to be able to hold its own without the other poems in the collection. I don't think there are very many poems like that in Home is Not a Country. You do need to read the whole thing. There are very few poems you can just take out of context and read and be like, wow, that really works as a poem, because the criteria was different, which was very liberating, because I came from a life where I've been agonizing over every single word of every single line of every single poem. And it takes 3 days to write 2 words. And so it was a relatively quick drafting process, because I could just use the word that occurred to me without being like, lacuna or pond. I could just be like, okay, whatever, body of water, and then move on to the rest of the line, because it was the first time that I was really trying to use a poem as a vehicle for information, which is, again, very counter to the way that I historically have used poems. So it was like very difficult to write, again, because it entailed a bunch of things that I did not already know how to do. But the poems almost are not poems to me. They're just like little short bits of language with line breaks.
Yeah, so like it's interesting because obviously like a novel is like it has a story, so there's a plot, and you know there's different elements of a plot when there's a climax and there's a this and there's a start and there's a beginning and all of these things, and there's characters, and each character is independent and you have to bring out their personality and their history. And so I understand like when you're writing a novel in prose, you have 100,000 words or whatever it is, 70,000 words to write it. And maybe my feeling, and also my feeling from reading actually, is that I don't think authors antagonize over every single word. I think they antagonize over some words for sure, and some phrases and stuff. But I think I guess it's a lot more forgiving just to get it out onto the page. But as you said, like poetry isn't for you, especially, but poetry is not like that. Did you feel that while writing, like how did you try and get that balance right? Because I know you've said that like, it was liberating, but there was still the balance. You didn't want it to just become a story, just a novel, but you also needed it. you needed to still keep the poetry alive. How did you find that balance?
Process from the beginning is that I really only I edit by reading out loud. And again, because my early training was in performance and all that, it just means that my ear is better trained than my eye. So I can hear things that I wouldn't immediately catch just by looking at something on the page. And so there are still standards of like musicality and rhythm that I require of any piece of language that I put on the page, even if it is just trying to hurry it through because we're wondering what's going to happen to the main character. Yeah. It can't be clunky. It can't be a collection of words that don't feel good to say out loud, because then that just means it's an unfinished draft. So even though none of these are poems that I would just like get up and read independently in a poetry set or send out to be published in a literary magazine, they still are poems. And there are standards in place for if I'm going to call something a poem. It has to have, again, rhythm, musicality, a kind of texture to it. It has to haunt a little bit. Like it has to create the quality that there's more to what's being said than what is being articulated. So all of that was still very much at play during the drafting and the editing process. But whereas usually with a poem, I would take it to 8 or 9 rounds of revision on the level of line and the language, because I was multitasking in this, where the revision had to be simultaneously for language, rhythm, musicality, texture, tone, hauntingness, and also narrative. Like, is there a plot hole here? Is this character for what I have set up about this character? Then I had to make some sacrifices, just time and energy and my own capacity. I was like, okay, I can get this to 3 or 4 rounds of revision for language. And then I have to surrender and be at peace with the fact that it's not girls never die. That's fine.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting to hear about. I absolutely loved Home is Not a Country. I've actually read it a few times because I'm just like, this is so amazing. And I also really, really like the title, because I also think that home is not a country. And I think my idea of home continually changes, because home is, sometimes it's people, sometimes it's how you feel, sometimes it's food and smells, and it's lots of different things. What were you most interested in exploring in Home is Not a Country?
I think I was. So what has ended up happening with my body of work is that my 2 novels in verse are thematically linked to the poetry collections that they came out right after. More things I want to say on the topic, and then here comes the novel in verse. So on the heels of The January Children, which is a book that's very concerned with like diasporic longing. But after I wrote and published that book, after spending a couple years in the aftermath of it, I changed my mind about a lot of what I thought and felt at the time of writing those poems. It's not to say I'm still like pretty proud of those poems, but like those poems as like a piece of text, as a piece of craft, not as like a piece of philosophy, where I just felt very like those poems are overly concerned the nation state as a site of belonging. And like with very little nuance, being like, if I had a country I could claim for myself, I would feel better and less isolated and less complicated. And I don't believe that. I don't know that I ever believed that, to be honest, but I think that kind of was the prominent discourse in diasporic spaces at the time, that like, I'm not enough of this or the other thing. And that was not actually my experience, to be honest. I moved countries a lot as a young person, but like pretty consistently grew up deeply embedded in diasporic Sudanese spaces. And so I had quite a Sudanese upbringing and quite surrounded by Sudanese people. at almost every juncture of my life. And so this kind of hybrid Sudanese-ness, I'd never really thought of it as a thing to mourn. I actually feel quite celebratory about the resilience of Sudanese-ness that my people have been able to pick up and pull up to every single corner of the world and resume Sudanese-ness. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I didn't feel removed or isolated or incomplete or not quite or any of that. I felt and have always felt pretty Sudanese, very Sudanese. And this idea of not being American enough, like being Americanness is such a prize. Like that's okay. They can keep it. I felt maybe misrepresented by some of the tone with which I'm talking about my identities in the January Children. And so I guess you're maybe not supposed to go into a project with such an agenda, but I did want to write a character who's a young Sudanese American, even though Sudan is not explicitly named in the book. And I wanted to walk her through that life cycle of diasporic longing, of being like, everything would be better if I had grown up in my country of origin. Everything would be better if I had a direct thing to call myself. And in doing that, kind of taking for granted and dismissing all of the kinds of belonging that have been available the whole time, and like devaluing the people around who have done such a difficult and good job of creating community, creating belonging, and then having to go through this whole process to arrive at the end at the realization that belonging is community, home is other people. It's not, you don't belong somewhere just because some British guy drew a line on the map and was like, that's where you belong. That, I don't think if I had been raised in a single country, I don't know that I would have been like, ugh, these lines on the map really do it for me. So wanted to have a character through that line of inquiry as well, to arrive at the thing that is my agenda to push, which is the idea that, like, I think we need to release ourselves from the belief that countries can do anything for us other than us, to be honest. That was my, almost like my disclaimer in the aftermath of the January Children. So now I think of them as being kind of diptych to be read together.
I find that, it's so fascinating and so true, because I feel like I've grown very tired of this, I'm like, not enough of this and not enough of this. And I feel like, but we're all more than enough of this, and also this and this and this. Like, there's so many different elements of our identity and our community and our belongingness that like fuel who we are. And I think it's a lot more nuanced and complicated. But you're right, like it was a very heavy rhetoric, and it seemed to resonate with a lot of people, because I think it was a good conversation starter, and I think it helped put feeling to some experience and some to put words to some experiences and some feelings that I guess we were experiencing as we were growing up, especially some of us children of immigrants. I know you moved to the US when you were very young, and so you were growing up as this person who was now living in the US but from Sudan, and it's all very different. And yeah, like I think it served a purpose, but yeah, I feel like I've really grown very tired of it. And so I really love the way that you've explored it. And one of the things that you write so beautifully about is about language. And I wondered if you could just reflect a little bit on what is it about language that you are most interested in, and I guess that what do you really think about it and you're keen to explore through your work?
Yeah, I think that part of my deep obsession with language can be attributed to, I don't know, diaspora stuff, where everything about especially when I first moved here, like my relationship to each of my two languages like took turns being intense. When I first moved here, I was a fluent speaker, reader, writer of Arabic, and English was fine. I'd been to only English language schools up until that point. but I had an accent, and everyone seemed like largely unconvinced that I spoke English. So my first order of business was to be like a convincing speaker of English. During that time, because no one was talking to me at the time about how like fluency is a muscle, so I just put the Arabic away, and I was like, it's always been there. It'll be there when I get back. But that's not quite how it works. And so it then became this thing where you have to keep two plates spinning at one time, and it just doesn't, it depends on the shape of my life in a given moment, what my relationship is to either language. But I have such a fraught relationship to fluency. I think anytime I have been accused of being good at a particular language, it has immediately collapsed my confidence in my abilities of that language, because then it's so high stakes and really sets it up that you can, if you don't continue to be amazing and articulate, everyone is going to be disappointed or whatever. So I remember to this day, to be honest, I like encounter older Sudanese people who express surprise at the fact that I speak Arabic. And then I'm like, oh no, now I can't mess up my Arabic in front of them. Otherwise everything will be ruined. But also it is such a fraught enterprise to pursue fluency or eloquence or articulation in English for anyone, to be honest, and particularly for anyone who's not white. So every time, still to this day, that I have been praised for my English, it has not felt like a compliment. You know what I mean? There's always something a little spicy underneath that, like, I go home and it makes me feel itchy.
Yeah, so there's always a sinister undertone there.
The reasons I love poetry so much is because it, for me, has been one of the only spaces where I can sit down with language and fail on purpose and break the language and mess with it and use an odd syntax and say something in a way that it takes the reader a moment to receive the information contained in it. Where I think of, if a sentence is a unit of information, I don't really have much use for the sentence in the space of a poem. The unit in a poem is a line, which for me is not about information. It's about everything else: sensation, sound, texture, vibes. A more interesting way to engage with language and what it can do, because ultimately we're all just making noises at each other and like accepting that those noises have universally accepted meanings. And about the space of a poem is you're just going back to the elemental making of noises and prioritizing what feels and sounds good over what makes sense. And in a world where I have had to myself to make sense and to be legible to like the people that I encounter, it is just consistently really fun for me exist in a space where I don't have to make even a little bit of sense. And very freeing, healing. It also, I think, makes me more resilient when I go back out into spaces and everyone's like, you're so well spoken. And I care less, because I think it also, I wonder if it would be different for me if I wrote poetry in Arabic. But part of the reason I think I am able to write poetry in English is because I've learned that English doesn't matter to me. I don't care. It's not sacred to me. So I can really mess with it. I can sit down, I can pull the words apart and stretch them and examine them and put them in weird orders and slightly misuse a word or verb, a noun or whatever, because I'm not afraid of doing a bad job as an English speaker. I actually would love to do a bad job as an English speaker. And I think that's just really fertile ground for poetry, to be like, instead of being like, what is the correct way to use this verb to prove to the gatekeepers of English that I did a good job, that I like succeeded? I'm interested in the wrong way and in the kinds of English that I and my communities were made fun of for using when I was a younger person. So I don't know. It's just a really fun, kind of petty, experimental space where I can just sit down and chip away at the language that so much of my self-worth and self-valuation was tied up in, and to make it strange. The only way I can ever enjoy myself in this language that I did not necessarily choose for myself is
Yeah.
to freak it, make it weird, make it strange, wrong,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, that's really, really beautiful, and you do it. You do it a lot in your writing. You take these English words and you mix them up and you mold them, and you really, I think, experiment. And I can understand where you're coming from when you say that it's because English to you is not sacred. And I have such a fraught relationship also with the English language, and I don't feel like it's sacred. I feel like it's probably my biggest like tool, my biggest like tool I have in communication and in making a difference in the world, but it doesn't feel sacred. I really get that. And with Home is Not a Country, I'm very interested in where you got the idea for the story, and if you could just take a moment just to introduce like exactly what the story is about.
Yeah. So Home is Not a Country is about a very deeply nostalgic teenager from an unnamed country of origin that's based on Sudan, who's now living in an unnamed American suburb. And she's deeply obsessed with an alternate version of herself. What would she have been like? What would her life have been like if she had only grown up in her country of origin? So intense is her obsession with this alternate version of herself that she conjures her, she makes her real, and they go on an adventure together to get some answers.
It is so fascinating because it has this time travel element and this sort of you explore the unseen world of like jinns and like spirits, and it's just so fascinating. And one of my favorite bits you explore this. She has a very fraught relationship with her mother, and there's things that, as I think with so many parent-child relationships, like she feels like she just doesn't really know her. There's this like barrier, and at one point she's looking at a picture of her parents and she says, "These are my parents before they were my parents." And I just, that line, I feel like is because it means so much, because that experience, like as a child, but also as an adult, to think about your parents, who they were before they became your parents, but also even now who they are outside of being your parents, because we have such a myopic view of our parents as just that one thing. And I found it so beautiful and very emotive and emotional, because I think it's a really fascinating thing to explore.
Thank you.
And so you explore lots of family dynamics in Home is Not a Country, and we have some like a love story, and we've got a little bit of friendship. But I think friendship you explore also quite a lot in your poetry collection, Girls That Never Die, especially in the poem Ode to My Home Girls, which is one of my favorite in the collection. It's so sweet, and it really brings out the different nuances and the different elements of friendship. Like you talk about the sort of smell, knowing how your friend smells, the ability that friends have just to walk into each other's room and just say, "Look, I know you're going through something really awful, but we're going out. You need to get out and we're taking you out." How your friends can take charge of your life, but also how they act as protectors and they help you get out of trouble, and all of these really wonderful experiences. Why did you decide to write about friendship, and what were you really hoping to convey?
Yeah, I am sad that I haven't written more about friendship up until this point, because that has been many of the great love stories of my life have been just platonic friendships.
Mm.
Um, and those are really, I think so many cultures demote friendship to like a tier under romantic relationship, where like the thing we're all supposed to really aspire to is romantic relationship, and your friends are just a placeholder until that happens. That just so is not how my friendships have been conducted. We are in each other's business. We're like a little obsessed with each other. And I like the fact that I, over the years, have written so many poems about just like random guys whose phone numbers I don't have anymore, and have not taken the same amount of time and energy to celebrate my friends, to write odes. It feels like a real mismanagement of my time, to be honest. Where I just, and Ode to My Homegirls in particular was written when I had just moved to Oakland, to California, and from DC. And my two closest childhood best friends, we had all ended up back in DC, where we overlapped there as adults for maybe about a year. And it was so fun. It was like all of the familiarity and closeness and intimacy of childhood friends, except this now we had the like freedom and mobility and resources of adults. And it's so fun. And then I moved across the country and them so much and realized that I had really taken for granted that kind of belonging and surroundedness, because in the cities that I'd lived in as an adult up until that point, I did have those kind of like close, specific femme friendships. And then I was in a new city where I like did have dear friends, but it was just a very different genre of friendship. And I just missed that thing where you're like, all go out and everyone falls asleep in their makeup, and the next day your homegirl's body glitter is all over your sheets and it will never come out ever again, no matter how many times you wash them, or always like a strip of false eyelashes in some corner of my apartment, no matter how much I clean. That just that like specificity, or just thinking about like the one or two times we've all gone on vacation together and just how disgusting a hotel room is when a bunch of girls are sharing it and there's just like makeup shattered in the sink. And like, it just, because like so much of poetry for me comes from having a very specific well of images where it's not enough to be like the sky is blue. It has to be specific. And I was like, why is it that this is the part of my life that I have the most specific well of images for, and I've never used it in a poem? I can right now sit down and conjure the exact feeling, smells, textures, vibes of being in a Holiday Inn somewhere with 7 girls, and we're all getting ready to go out, and one is like hopping around in one high heel because she doesn't know where the other one is, and 3 straightening irons are on, and we might set the room on fire, and like someone's makeup broke in the sink, and also like we've been at the pool, so there's like a kind of nasty damp smell also in the room. Why is it that I have all of these really specific images and I don't think that they deserve to be elevated to the space of having a poem? Like, why is it that I can sit down and write 17 lines about the tree flowering outside my window and not my homegirl's fake eyelash strip being in my pillowcase? So I wanted to give those images, those memories, the ode treatment, because that, if there is ever anything in my life that deserves to be celebrated at the level of an ode, it's that. And I only hope that.
Do you think that part of the reason why you haven't written so much about friendship is to protect them, protect your friends, or protect the sacred nature of your bonds with them?
I don't think so, because also I'm pretty particular in general in a poem where I can't put someone's business in a poem if it's not already in the world. Like, I'm not going to be the one that breaks the news about someone else in a poem. But a lot of it is tied to some of that very early conditioning where I just forgot that you didn't have to be sad to write a poem sometimes, and that I could write a poem celebrating things that feel good instead of mourning things that feel bad. And I am trying to create some balance there where just like my mourning voice, my grief voice is so old and practiced, and my celebration voice, I just put it on a shelf and forget about it for long stretches of time. Because I also, especially now that I have a body of work to look back on, I don't want to misrepresent the time I'm having in the world. I have a poem that it's not in a book anywhere, but I have a poem called Ode to Sudanese Americans, which I wrote after Ode to My Homegirls, because I was like, again, I think my body of work makes it seem like I'm having a bad time being Sudanese, and I'm actually having quite a good time being Sudanese. And I need to populate my body of work a little bit better with something that indicates that. And I think a lot of my poems signal that I'm having a bad time being a femme person in the world. And yes, patriarchy and danger and all of that. And also there are spaces in which I'm having a really good time and I feel really held and safe and celebrated. And I need to remember to make a record of that feeling too.
Yeah, that, and I think also because, I mean, with this particular collection, Girls That Never Die, there are not that many poems that are celebratory. In fact, I think this might be the only one in this collection. You write a lot about pain, in this collection. Pain at the hands of patriarchy, at the hands of men, at the hands of other women, at the hands of systems, heartbreak, lots of different forms of pain. But then we have this really beautiful ode to your homegirls. But when writing about pain, I know you said before that what you've written about, you have already processed. So you've done the work on yourself, or you've healed from whatever a personal experience or processing of something happening outside of yourself as well. But it's still very sad. Some of those poems were or are very sad and really difficult to read and difficult to imagine and picture. How do you deal with writing about some of these darker things?
I think it helps that I have a lot of protections around myself now, where I can separate out it's sad from I'm sad. If feel like a state of emergency for me, then it's surely not going to be a poem. But I've processed this, I've worked on it. It doesn't mean that it's like case closed. It's still, patriarchy is ongoing. I didn't fix it in therapy yet.
Sure.
You know, it does mean that I am better equipped to protect myself. So I'm not just a raw nerve navigating through these meditations and then putting it out in public for people to read and engage with and have opinions about. Yeah, it's not that I've healed in a kind of linear way where the wound is sealed up and now I can report from the aftermath. But it's that it's in the space of the poem. This is not the first time I am asking myself these questions. And it's not the first time I'm doing these things. And so I am more likely to know at what point I have to stop before it starts for me. And at this point also, again, because I've just been in poetry for so long and been like in autobiographical poetry for so long, I can take quite a lot at the hands of my poetry. I can endure quite a lot, and I can put myself and my speaker through things that I would not put other people in my life through. But so I'm not like under the impression that, like, I know the poems are sad. The poems are supposed to be sad because I am not honestly in an exclusively celebratory space right now. And I think it would be dishonest to write Girls That Never Die as just a book full of odes only, because we're not there yet. You know? Even the fact of Ode to My Homegirls, I don't think Ode to My Homegirls could exist without the sad poems around it, because Ode to My Homegirls is not a happy poem. It's a joyful poem. You know what I mean? And this distinction might be, I might be misusing the words, but I think of it as, or it's not like a content poem or I don't know. I'm not sure what word I prefer to use there, but let's, for the sake of argument, use happiness and joy, where it's not just that, like, the tone is celebratory because everything is all good and the world is perfect and we fixed patriarchy, racism, and we're all and can go out for a jog at night alone. It's not that. It is a celebration of of resilience in the face of all of this danger and sadness and harm and downtroddenness. I am in awe of the existence of these kinds of spaces where, despite the world outside, we are able to create spaces that are better than the world outside and safer and more accepting than the world outside. But in order to fully characterize these spaces, I have to talk about the world outside. I have to contextualize them, because that is the only way I can show what a flex it is that those spaces are able to exist despite. There needs to be something on the other end of the despite, otherwise, like, the portrait is incomplete. It's not, and in a perfect world, no one would have to be resilient because everything would just be easy and safe. But unfortunately, we live in a world where resilience is required. And I think it would be dishonest of me to celebrate those spaces without underscoring the resilience required to create and maintain those spaces. Because it is, like, it's all in context. And like my whole life and my whole context comes into every poem, no matter the tone. And I don't think it is representative of the time I'm having in the world to be like, just because me and my friends had fun at brunch does not mean that the world is not dangerous and
Yeah.
oppressive and patriarchal and unkind and unfair. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Because sometimes some, I guess, I don't know, some presentations of friendship seem to be really cut off from the world. So it's about, I'm just thinking, if I think about Instagram, so it's like pictures of a bunch of girls at brunch having a really great night, or like matching outfits on a night out, or like a hen do or something like, and these feel so, and they, I think in their experience too, these particular instances are away from some of the awful things happening in that moment, but not always, but sometimes. But actually, what you reminded me of is the fact that what friendship shows us is what happens when women come together in a world that is so horrible. And with all of these things going on, women are literally saving each other's lives and uplifting one another and helping each other through really awful times and doing amazing things. And that's just in the realm of friendship. But that exists, as you said, with this world, within this world that is absolutely horrible. So yeah, I really enjoyed hearing you speak about that just now. And I know you've written also about your own Sudanese identity, and I don't want to end this podcast without reflecting, if you wouldn't mind, just on what's happening in Sudan at the moment, where millions of people have been made refugees and are projected to starve in what has been over 1 year of this current war. I don't even know if that is the right word to use. And also, but Sudan has historically for years and decades been struggling with all kinds of situations when it comes to conflict and war and genocide and starvation and famine. But I think one of the worst things is that what we're seeing at the moment is that it's not getting the attention that it deserves. It's not reaching a conclusion. It's not getting any better. And actually, projections are that by September, there's going to be absolutely awful things that are going to happen to millions of people. And I just wondered, like, how that's affecting you as a writer as well and as a poet, because you do also write about your own Sudanese identity. And I just wanted to offer some space for you to reflect on that.
It's still all too much of an emergency right now for me to write a poem, it feels like. Where I have been writing primarily prose to try, because again, I right now don't think I think a lot about that Toni Morrison quote about how this is precisely the time when artists go to work. We speak, we write, we do language. So that's a very helpful invitation to use my tools to try to be helpful. But I don't think I would be being particularly helpful if I was like writing and publishing a bunch of poems about how sad I am right now. I actually think that is really helpful to my people or to myself. So I'm like, okay, as a writer, I have a responsibility to use the things that I am good at to like help. And so this is a moment where writing becomes for me, unlike in the space of a poem, writing becomes for me a vehicle for information, because most non-Sudanese people I know don't really know what's going on because there's just not a lot of official media coverage. There was a moment a while ago where almost every like major Western news outlet was referring to the war in Sudan as the forgotten war, which, you know, as you can imagine, felt amazing. So again, it begs the question of whose memories are being centered, because I don't know anyone who's forgotten. Why this insistence that that my people are forgotten? Because I can't point to a single person in my life who has forgotten, and I know a lot of people. So what is the intention behind this constant naming of it as the forgotten war? But I do think it is, I believe that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we're able to like care about multiple things and help out in multiple ways at the same time. But Absolutely. That tends to be an inconvenient narrative for a lot of mainstream media, where it's just that we can only care about one thing at a time and everything else is a distraction from that. And that our empathy is a limited resource or something like that, which I actually believe we have infinite capacity for empathy if left to our own devices.
Yeah.
It's tricky because it's very clear that because Sudan is an African country, everyone thinks this is just the natural order of things for us. Sudanese people always starving and doing war with each other. Isn't that how it's always been? And so it's treated like it's not an emergency, first of all, and we should be used to it. Also, it's treated as an inevitability, which I think lets a lot of people off the hook. Where like, if this is the natural order of things, if it's inevitable, then what is it that we as people are supposed to do to intervene with just nature? Which is very frustrating to me. I think it also, because Western media in particular loves a clear-cut narrative, it's like they have not quite been able to tease out a spin that makes this compelling for an audience that doesn't already care. Because I do think the attitude does seem to be like, what are we all supposed to do? They're doing it to each other. It's not an outside aggressor for people to rise up against the injustice. It is Sudanese people killing Sudanese people. So people are like, that's their business. They should just stop killing each other, which I think is really a really narrow and uninformed way of looking at it, because Sudan is just one of the parts of the world that has some of the most, like, what is the word? But just has a lot of natural resources that other countries want to get their hands on. We have gold, we have water, we have very fertile land, like all this stuff. We have access to the Red Sea coast that is relatively untouched and unclaimed. So it means that there are a lot of other countries that are finding a way to fight a proxy war through these two armies. And the Sudanese people are human collateral damage of this like scramble for resources and water and coastline and stuff like that. But it's inconvenient to frame it that way because people want to go on vacation in Dubai and not have to feel guilty about it. So it's easier to just be like, why can't the Sudanese people just get it together and stop being when... And so it is very... It does sometimes a little bit feel like it's all of these Sudanese people on the internet preaching to the choir, where it's been 15 months now, almost, of war, 14 months maybe, of war. And I'm still like, I see a lot of people newly arrive, which, okay, sure, better late than never. I'm talking about social media in particular, which is where most of the reporting by Sudanese people has been given a platform.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of people show up to my friends' pages where they've been sharing for over a year resources, explainers, historical context, articles, infographics, everything. And they're all already there. Like you can just scroll back and find them. And someone will show up on a post 14 months later and be like, what's going on? Can you explain it to me? And so no one wants, it seems, let me not be dramatic, not no one, but a lot of people want it like neatly packaged into a soundbite.
Yeah.
In order to care. But if it requires like doing some research, which at first there could be the argument that, oh, there's not a lot of information out there. Now there's plenty of information because I know plenty of people who have done the labor of making that information available, accessible, and like very simply broken down so that it's easy to consume. It really is a bunch of non-Sudanese people pulling up 14 months after the fact being like, explain to me why it's bad quickly. And that's very frustrating to me because it feels this labor for, is it just Sudanese people telling a bunch of other Sudanese people that war is bad? Yes, all of us lost homes and family members and have had our whole lives thrown into chaos now. And so the Palestinian American poet Hala Alian wrote an essay a few months ago about auditioning for empathy. And I think that language is very helpful here as well, where you know, there are very, I can't think of a single way to audition for empathy that doesn't feel ethically fraught because like theoretically people should care already because it is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. It is currently the largest number of displaced people in the world. And like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are projected to die of starvation by September. And there have been like massive reports of just like inconceivable violence, sexual assault, just like really harrowing stuff. But that's not enough for people to be like, oh no, that's bad. We have to be like, all human life started in Sudan. Then it's, oh, this is an exceptional place. And so now it's sad that this is happening. But if it was just any degular African country, then just leave them to it. Or having to be like, look at the pyramids. Aren't they so beautiful? Isn't it so sad that a country this beautiful is going through something like this? I feel very frustrated by that, by having to dust off and parade around proof of beauty in order to harness some empathy that may or may not yield any action, to be honest. That's also, I think very frustrating to me, where I think we are in this social media attention economy where a post is considered a complete action, and or an expression of feeling bad is considered a complete action. And so people are not calling and writing to their representatives. They're not donating. They're not showing up to protest, because they're like, I'm a good person because I feel bad about this bad thing that's happening. Activism complete. And so there's a lot of stagnation that could be replaced by action. And it's just all very frustrating. And I think the kind of selfishly, the frustration is very helpful to me. Frustration and anger are very useful right now because there's stuff I can do that's using those as the engine. And it helps me turn away from how heartbroken I am, how sad I am, because kind of then there's nothing I can do. If I start crying, I will never stop crying. So better to be pissed off.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really hear you. And what you said at the beginning about it being called the forgotten war, that's such an awful phrase to use, because forgotten means that it was known or remembered. Exactly. And has now been forgotten. One of the biggest issues, and I do believe this, that because of the Western media agenda, or like their decision not to forget but to exclude, is what means that so many people don't know or don't know enough or are not reminded. Forgetting is it's just a complete wrong word. Ignored, isolated, suppressed, like all of those words, they work. I don't think
on top of everything else it means.
Exactly. But Safia, honestly, I really hope that things do, that they do get better, that Sudan gets the attention that it desperately deserves, and it deserved it and it needed it 14 months ago. But as you said, like, better late than never. But I really hope that things do improve. And on a personal level, like, I hope that you're okay and everything with your family as well. But it has been so lovely speaking to you on the show today. Thank you so much. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I'd really love to hear from you. It would also mean so much to me if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.